What are the most common financial challenges blended families face that most people don't even see coming?
Yeah, great question. To be honest, most people just aren't very good about talking about money. They ended somehow tragically, right? It's either divorce or death.
What's the vibe, dads? Welcome back to another episode of Dad Life Blueprint, where we keep it real about parenting, partnership, and purpose. I'm your host, Blake, and today we're diving into a topic that doesn't get talked about enough but needs to. Today we're talking about money, but not just budgets and spreadsheets. Today we're getting into the emotional, relational, and practical side of finances in blended families. Because when two lives come together and two families come together, money can be one of the trickiest things to figure out. Joining me today is Brian Peterson, who's a financial advisor who specializes in helping blended families merge their money, build trust, and create sustainable systems that work for everyone involved. Brian brings real talk, real tools, and a deep knowledge of the numbers and the human side of finance. Whether you're in a blended family now or navigating the possibility in the future, this episode is packed with insight that you can use right away. Let's get into it. Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Blake. Glad to be here.
So, to get started here, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and what led you to specialize in helping blended families with their finances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I, I guess I'll just jump right into that specialization thing. It kind of came out of the blue, to be honest. I grew up in a blended family. Actually, both my parents had a marriage before they got married. So I'd be what's called an ours child. They both had kids from their first marriage, and then they had me and my younger sister, and then they divorced when I was five-ish. And then they both have remarried and have new spouses. Well, they're not new. They've both been married now for 30 some years. I guess third time's a charm for them.
Yeah.
So I have, step parents and stuff too. And just, I started, so I've been a financial planner since 2008. I was a career changer kind of because of 2008, if you're old
Mm-hmm.
enough. Anybody listening is old enough to know.
Yeah.
And I was in the middle of looking for a job and ended up losing that job. Company it was a real small consulting company, and they let most everybody go at the
Okay.
time, and then brought a few people back as things settled out, but I had moved on. So to this. But it wasn't until 2019, I got engaged after being divorced myself in 2012. So I started a blended family myself and started going through more or less what my process had been, which is very life-centered and
Yeah.
lifestyle focused for clients. But so I tried to apply that with me and my wife, and it worked okay. But it was going through that with her and how we bring our family together, and how we bring our financial situation together it just dawned on me, you know what, this is different.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these techniques still apply, but there's definitely some different dynamics, which is funny considering I've always been in a blended family, but it gives you the difference of perspective of being a child in a blended family versus being one of the parents or step parents in a blended
Right.
family. Totally different viewpoint.
Right.
So, I mean, that's how I ended up starting down this road. My wife, Kara, and I just kind of talked about it. And while I was in the middle of launching my own firm, actually leaving a broker dealer and doing all of that, what do we want to focus on? And it just kind of hit there.
Yeah. Yeah. Similarly, to how I ended up starting Dad Life Blueprint, I jumped into being a dad, a bonus dad
Yeah.
when I got remarried. And as we were looking into resources around blended families, I found there aren't great resources out there. There are resources, but I don't see as many things as like just parenting in general, and saw that there was an opportunity there and a
Yeah.
need. And that's kind of what led me to launch Dad Life Blueprint. So there's a need out there for these kind of resources. And with that in
Absolutely.
mind, maybe you can talk a little bit about what are the most common financial challenges blended families face that most people don't even see coming.
Hmm. Yeah, great question. I mean, one of the things about blended families is the dynamics can vary quite a bit, but it's
Right.
having an understanding of what's causing those. I mean, usually they're relationship driven, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
For me and our process, we like to go back to the beginning. This is like how I think of it, and we call it creating a unified vision. Because when you have a blended family, inherently there's at least one member of the couple was married before, right? Probably
Right.
kids and stepkids. And that previous or those previous relationships, marriages, for example, they ended somehow tragically,
Right.
right? It's either
Right.
divorce or death. And I can't think of any other way those happen, right?
Yeah.
And you go through this period of upheaval where you were dependent on somebody. Now you're have to be independent. And oh, if you have kids in the equation, now you have to be independent, taking care of the kids. Plus, you also have to share the kids with the person
Right.
you just divorced, potentially, right? If it's a divorce
Right.
situation. So there's just a lot of dynamics that go into there. And to be honest, most people just aren't very good about talking about money, whether it's a blended family or not, because it's an uncomfortable topic. And so when
Yeah.
I say going back to the beginning, that's really what I mean. How do we talk about money and how do we bring the couple together? And we do that through a unified vision. And it really comes down to understanding like what how do you value money? What purpose does it serve in your life? Plus your history, because we all have a money history, right? Whether
Right.
it's how we grew up with money or our a previous marriage, if we were married before, there is a story there.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not all bad. That's not what I'm saying. There
Yeah.
are components, there are traumatic components, or what some people might call baggage,
Yeah.
right? But all of those help give us context into the people we are and the decisions we make. And so understanding those can help us move forward. And we combine that with the dreams and hopes and aspirations that you have as a blended family couple and create a unified vision to go forward. And that's
Yeah.
really the crux of how I look at it, which probably doesn't sound a whole lot financial, but that's the life centered approach that we take because that's starting at the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you had asked, what are some of the common things they don't even see coming? It's often it stems from that they get into people get into a relationship and they've never even talked about it.
Hmm.
And money problems from a dynamics standpoint anyway, that's where it stems from. We've never actually talked about what we believe individually and what we want to believe together. And so that's where we try to stem that off and help that conversation. Now, obviously, there are other habits that can be learned by individuals, whether it's spending um, or on the other spectrum, hoarding their
Yeah.
wealth, and it becomes a sense of power. Those are different dynamics that can happen too. But I think primarily it comes back to what do we want to do as a couple, and how do we believe we should use our money and our wealth to get the best life possible.
Yeah. I love that. And it totally makes sense um, to um, even just get people to have these conversations. And honestly, really, whether you're a blended family or not,
Yeah,
any kind of marriage or long-term partnership probably should be having these conversations about finances, because you probably are going to be sharing at least some expenses, if not totally blending your finances. But I imagine you run into a lot of difference because, like you said, like everybody has a backstory, financial history, and different habits and different relationship with money. So how do you, when you're trying to help people become unified,
Yeah.
How do you kind of navigate some of those differences?
Well, I'm a head-on sort of person.
Yeah.
And and we want to bring those up, those topics. So
Yeah.
we're actually in the process of launching a workbook. We have an ebook on our website, but we're launching a workbook that really brings this to light. How do people work through that process and have the conversation?
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. We all have made past money mistakes. I mean, most
Hmm.
people do, or something we look back and like, oh, wish I didn't do that.
Yeah.
Those are things that are hard to talk about. But if
Yeah.
you're in a committed relationship with somebody and a trusted relationship, you should be talking about it.
Yeah.
But it is hard. And I would just tell listeners though, nothing of worth comes easily, and that good things take a little bit of work and effort.
Yeah.
And the things, what we're talking about here can bring you and your spouse so much closer. You wouldn't even imagine it was possible, you know? Um,
Yeah.
and that's what I love about what we do.
Yeah, I love that. And it also I'm curious because I imagine you deal with families with kids of all different ages, right? And so
Right.
not only are you creating a unified vision with the couple, but I imagine there's some navigating some unification around things relating to the kids, right? Like financial planning around higher education or even things as simple as allowance, like do you
Yeah.
let your kids have allowances? I imagine all those come into play when you're having these conversations.
Absolutely. And it's different for every couple. So, one of the values questions we ask, for example, is when it comes to your kids, what do you want? And on one side of the scale, it's earn their own way. And the other side of the scale is give them every advantage.
Right.
And
Right.
sometimes you'll see, I mean, this could bring out a difference in couples or it
Yeah.
could bring them close together. But you have to take it a step further and say, okay, well, what does that really mean? And then in step families, you could dig deeper and say, my wife and I actually just talked about that this weekend.
Yeah.
What does it mean for a bio kid versus a step kid?
Right.
And whether you're talking about just spending like younger kids, right? Where
Yeah.
you may have activities, school supplies, birthday parties, those sorts of things, to older kids who are maybe launching their careers or just finishing up college or even in college. Those conversations are different. But
Yeah.
you have to start somewhere and say, okay, well, what do we believe and how do we want to handle it? And then obviously from the belief part and what you hope to have happen, then you got to look and say, okay, well, what resources do we actually have? Because that's a part of our reality too, right? What can
Yeah.
we actually afford to do in providing for our kids? So, um, yeah, it's a tough question
Yeah.
and I mean that's just a simple example, but yeah, it does matter between the ages of the kids, things evolve. And that's
Yeah.
an important part of these relationships too, especially in a blended family. You have to give room for things to change
Yeah.
because you might start on one extreme of another on how you bring your finances together. But over time, as that relationship builds trust and the relationships with the children and stepchildren, if that's involved, as those relationships evolve, things start to change a little bit, and you just need to be open to those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
That
why
makes sense.
talking about these things and learning how to is so important because it's
Yeah.
it's part of everyday life.
Yeah, and that's one thing like if I could give any piece of advice to, couples raising kids in general, like it's just talk about these things, right? Because exactly what you're pointing out, right? Everything evolves when you're dealing with children. Everything, it's not going to be the same when they're 2 as it is going to be when they're, 13, and these
Yeah.
conversations around any piece of the relationships with each other and the raising of kids, they change. The subject matter changes over time. And so just really getting ahead, staying ahead of those pieces and thinking about them and being vulnerable with each other and having those conversations that can be really challenging. And I love how you're doing this idea of unification, because I think that's actually a strong kind of centering place to think about lots of conversations when it comes to child rearing. How can you
For
unify
sure.
around creating shared values? I wonder too, then, how do you, because there's the relationship with each other, there's a relationship with the children and the household, but then in blended families, you also have the
Yeah.
other partner or
Yeah.
partners, unless it, there was a death, or if there's a divorce, you have these other partners that also conceivably have a say in at least one of the children, in some of the financial pieces. And so you're not only navigating it with each other, and you might have a shared unified vision within the couple, but then I can see that sometimes it could be challenging when the other parent might have a different financial, opinion about
Oh yeah.
something, thinking about like higher education, for example, college savings, that kind of thing. Do you encounter that, and how do you sort of help couples navigate some of those pieces?
That's definitely harder for us. I mean, it's harder for the
Yeah.
parents going through it too,
Yeah.
but it's harder for us because we obviously don't have a connection to the co-parents
Yeah.
usually. So depending on how, when we know our clients, these are some of the questions we ask. And there are tools out there. I'll just throw some out, and these are not mine. Blending.love is a good one
Okay.
that helps couples create a family map or a genogram of all the different relationships that affect their family.
Yeah.
And I haven't used I haven't used it with clients yet, but I have explored that because it's a cool tool.
Yeah.
Because that's a great, and it lets you assign a relationship status, for a lack of a better term. Like,
Yeah.
is this a good functioning relationship, or is this a intense conflict kind of relationship? And
Right.
so you can get a sense of that. And we do that through our conversations with clients, but we don't dig too much in there. For us, it becomes more of, okay, what do we see as the worst case scenarios,
Right.
and how can we prepare for that so it protects our client's financial future?
Yeah.
And sometimes it just comes down to, what do you want for your kids? How can we make that happen, right?
Yeah.
You gave a big example, a big ticket example, like college, paying for college.
Right. Right.
Ideally, that's something that's planned ahead of time. It isn't always, or
Right.
often even, really, especially in the case of divorce, where suddenly, assets get split up, and there's might be child support or alimony going somewhere.
Mhm.
So it diverts resources that maybe were going to college before, but now are going to child
Something else.
support or
Hmm.
what have you. It's just financially devastating, right? Divorce can be. So,
Yeah.
it's really, it's hard because like I said, we don't work with co-parents, but we have to try to get an understanding of what's happening and see how we can protect our clients from there through planning and preparing. But you just never know. That's one of those dynamics that it could blindside you, but with good, thoughtful preparation, you can be okay.
Yeah.
At least you can work through it and make changes. What
Yeah.
my wife and I had done, and our kids were close to college, we kind of kept our kids' college separate because we just had a couple graduate this past year, and then we still have two remaining in college, and then we have a high school kid who's a
Okay.
sophomore. So that's my youngest. And so going back to the evolution we talked about earlier, our older kids, we both did our own thing with them. With my youngest, we've started talking about, okay, how can we do this together? Which wasn't
Yeah.
really a thing because we've been together where he's been pretty young, and so she's been a big part of his life, and
Yeah.
the relationship changes right now. Very different dynamics though on the co-parent sides.
Right.
We're kind of the primary driver of the education. Not that there isn't help outside, but
Yeah.
We kind of knew that going in, and that was something we talked about as we were engaged in getting married on how to do. So it's trying to take that assessment, like what is the plan?
Right.
And with other things, you can take a simple example, Blake, like cell phones, right? That
Yeah.
can be a big one between co-parents, right? Well, I don't believe they should even have a cell phone. They're in sixth
Right.
grade or whatever it is. They're not old enough to have that. And I don't want to pay for it. Or I've heard those conversations before too. And at that
Yeah.
point, you have to decide. We don't get involved in the parenting part,
Yeah. Yeah.
but we can help our clients decide, okay, what does that mean from a financial standpoint if you decide to take this burden on, if it's a cell phone or a car or college for that matter, and you
Yeah.
just know the co-parent isn't going to help much, so at least
Yeah.
they can make an informed decision. Does that make sense?
It very much does. Yeah. That's really helpful to think about. And I wonder, like you mentioned one resource that's out there. Are there other tools that you use? Because I imagine it does kind of teeter on that line sometimes of you're sort of mediating with couples that maybe do have some different values around some of these things that just you don't even expect it to come up, but in the conversation about finances, all of a sudden it becomes a conversation about values around cell phone use for kids. Do you have things like when those kind of things come up? Do you have resources that you kind of send people to navigate that conversation that's really about values and child rearing versus finance? Or do you sort of just steer people back to the financial piece? And how do you kind of handle those in the moment, I guess, is what I'm getting at, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. Well, I mean, it depends on the situation. I would
Yeah.
first and foremost say, as a life-centered planner, and we
Right.
talk about values and things like that, those are the softer skills. It
Yeah.
can walk a fine line that I'm very careful about of feeling like therapy, because that's not what we do. There
Right.
are financial therapists more and more, and I know a few of them on the periphery, but haven't actually worked with anybody. I am a proponent of therapy though,
Yeah.
but I'm also, as far as blended resources, I think Family Life Blended, which is a ministry, is a great organization. And they have a lot of resources and a lot of connections in the non-financial industry, I guess, the parenting, relationships, ministry, obviously. And I've gotten over the last few years, I've gotten to meet a number of people through that organization, and they are amazing people, amazing programs. Kara and I were just down at their Blended and Blessed that they do every year. It was a great program. So, Ron Deal he's like the go-to guy for blended family relationships.
Uh-huh.
So he's got a whole series of books, and he runs Family Life Blended as the
Okay.
director for it. And those are kind of the outside resources, at least from a blended family standpoint, that we would recommend and send people to. There are a few others out there as well. There's some podcasts. Nacho Kids is a good podcast.
Yeah. I've heard of that one. Yeah. Yeah.
Blended Kingdom Families is another good podcast for blended families. Yeah, it's good stuff. We have to walk a fine line, stay in our lane. We like to use the values and history to put the clients in the driver's seat
Yeah.
about making financial decisions, right? We can help them make those financial decisions and help them get the best life possible with the
Yeah.
resources they have. That's
I guess another question that kind of popped in my head here is I know oftentimes because people are coming from very different financial backgrounds, right? Like, do you encounter situations where there's a big difference in the financial background of the two people coming together, right? Where one person maybe is coming into the picture with more resources and then the other. And how do you help couples avoid that causing resentment? Or, I mean, I know that part of it's the unified values and unification
yeah.
around a financial plan, but do you encounter that where somebody's coming in with more resources, the other person's not? Maybe that becomes a tension. and how do you help people navigate that piece?
Yeah, it's very common,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes it depends on their personalities and how they use money, but it
Yeah.
also depends on where did they come from,
Yeah.
and if they are coming from a divorce, how recently was that divorce? Have they been able to get on their feet themselves
Right. Right.
before getting into this relationship? A lot of those things impact that situation, but it's very common to see differences. And that's one of the reasons these conversations, being willing to talk about money, is important. It's also why it makes it hard because if you're the one who isn't in as good of a place financially, it could be embarrassing. If you're a man, it could be demeaning maybe a little bit. And, if you're the one in the better position, it could feel like you got to walk on eggshells,
Right.
maybe. There's a lot of dynamics that can happen in there, but it's those are the barriers that make it hard to have these
Right.
conversations, but you have to. Because there's nothing good that comes out from hiding those things, and you just have to learn to accept that it's out there. Hopefully, I mean, if you got married, let's assume you got married, hopefully those things are out there, right? I suppose I haven't run into it much where that's not out there, or at least not to some degree. It's known, um, but there are a lot of ways to work around that. You just need to figure out what that is for you. I mean, for example, you could. I'll throw me under the bus again. My wife and I, when we got married and moved, we started looking for a house because the houses we had wasn't going to fit all seven of us. Um, and so we needed to find a new place, and we did, but it was before we got married, so we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? So she sold her home, used the equity from that to buy what's now our home. Okay. Um, but we both paid the mortgage, and we had, even before we were married, even before I was living here, I was helping pay that, but I hadn't sold my home yet to get the equity from that. So, once we did that, then we used some of my equity to help finish the basement and things. But she had put much more into this home than I had, and that was her money, right? Before I had nothing to do with that. And she wanted to, through our conversations, she's like, I'd like to leave that to my kids. How can we do that? And so we've worked that up where she happened to have some life insurance that was about the same amount. So we said, well, how about we set the kids up as the beneficiary there? They get that if you were to die. And then I'll get the home, but there's always a way to figure it out, but you can't do it if you're hiding, you know. And so as long as you're willing as a couple to find a solution, we can find a solution. There's lots of ways. It's kind of my job is a lot. I mean, most people think of financial planning as a lot of math and science, right? It's just numbers, 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 but it's a lot of art too, in trying to fit how things fit together. Because there are a million ways to do one thing, just depends on what works best for you as a family.
What do you recommend to folks that are coming into the conversation and feeling some sort of shame or intimidation about sharing the information? Like maybe they've never, like you said, maybe they've just never had the conversation until they're sitting in front of you and, they're sort of forced into it. Are there some
Yeah.
tips or tools that you advise people, particularly men, I think, struggle with these conversations because of I do feel like there's a lot of pressure for men, right? And, to be, men tend to see themselves as the providers, as the ones that should be successful and have more resources, right? And so if there's some bad mistakes, or maybe in their divorce, they ended up in a financial status that's not what it
Yeah.
was before their divorce, and now they're heading in and they're feeling that pressure. Do you have recommendations for those folks that are coming into the conversation? How do they kind of get over those fears and just have the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's a deep-rooted issue or concern, I go back to therapy and
Therapy.
meeting with
Yeah.
a counselor. There's no shame in that. No gets ahead alone.
Right.
We all have people in our life who have helped us, and that's a great
Yeah.
thing. That's a strength.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's just some things we're not capable of, even though we like to talk about the family values and the beliefs and what's important to you and why those move you. Just if you have deep rooted anxiety or fear or guilt or shame, you need to see a counselor, somebody who can help you put those things into perspective. And so that's by what you're describing, that's what I would recommend somebody
Recommend.
does. That honestly, that's a hard thing to do. I mean, I've had clients before in tears and joke like, hey, I know you're not my therapist, but they're talking about heartfelt things
Yeah.
when we have these conversations about their kids or what they hope for their kids, and they're failing to launch or whatever, and they're just seeing them struggle, and it's heartbreaking. And so those are hard times, but we can listen well, but there's not much we can do. And so we would, you know, recommend they go to a therapist of their choice and deal with some of those things. Yeah.
When should when should they start having these conversations, right? I would imagine that, like the earlier the better, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ideally it's, while you're engaged, maybe even before you're engaged, you could start having them. I would say once you're engaged, you should be looking to really dig in and see how do you want to move forward, because there's a lot of decisions to make, blending your family and blending your finances. And while they're related, they're also separate, right? But they definitely influence one another. And so the earlier the better. Most people don't, which makes it make it a little bit harder. But yeah, the sooner you do this in your relationship, the better off I think you'll
Better.
be. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Because
know.
otherwise you're just open to being blindsided by things.
Right.
You get so
Right.
caught up in planning the wedding and the wedding day and moving people in. Because let's face it, there's a lot of logistics to do that with a blended family when it involves kids and everything. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
moving parts. So it can be hard to do that, but it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know my wife and we actually started having a lot of conversations around blending even in the phase that we were when we first started dating before we were even talking about marriage.
Yeah.
I think we just kind of knew that to me, like I didn't have any kids of my own coming into it, and I knew that she had a young child who's now his bonus dad, but I think that added a level of seriousness to me to really like make sure we were having those conversations and that we were aligned as we move forward with things. To your point, right, that we were unified in a lot of these values, and if not, then could we get on the same page about things? And I think there's just so many more, like to your point, there's so many more logistics and pieces that get added into that when you're talking about blending families that have children and previous partners and all these pieces. And so the sooner the better. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see blended families make when they're thinking about finances or money?
Yeah. I think I had two thoughts that came to mind. I think one, maybe jumping in without really thinking it through would be
Yeah,
one, because you can get caught up in the moment of wedded bliss, for lack of a better term, I guess. And it's all well intended, but it just might not be thought through. Because and what I mean by that is just making decisions that are maybe long term or permanent financial decisions that might have consequences for your kids, or it might ruin your opportunity to leave something for your kids that you wanted to in the past. And so
right.
just not being thoughtful about it. And it's not the end of the world. Like I said, there's usually ways to work around and find solutions. It's rare that anything is permanent, but um, I just and then on the so jumping in like, no, we're just gonna do this and kind of holding your ground to that would be one thing. On the other end, it would be not being open to the evolution of the relationship and how things operate, because that is going to change. It just does, as the relationship, ideally it's coming closer, but you're also going to learn more about the family dynamic, the fits and starts. Um, Hopefully you don't have a crisis of with whether it's competition from the outsiders, the outside homes, so to speak, or I mean, there's just so many things that come into play. You have to be pretty nimble as a blended family couple, and you have to be on the same page as best you can so that obviously there's going to be differences, and we want to acknowledge those differences and be
Yeah.
aware of them, you know, so that we're not blindsided with it, right?
Yeah. And when it comes to navigating these conversations and thinking about all this, how often should I would imagine it's an ongoing conversation, right? Like you don't just, it's not like you have the conversation, you make your plan and you throw it in a drawer, right? Like, do you recommend, like I had some friends of mine who they weren't in a blended family, but just as a couple, they were, the guy is an entrepreneur and like they would have a weekly financial meeting as a couple before they even had kids. They'd have a weekly financial meeting. So
Okay.
I mean, do you recommend like they're talking about this weekly or at least like once a month or a couple times a year? And do your clients kind of stick with you and have those conversations in an ongoing way, or do they sort of take the reins after the initial setup and just do it on their own, or how does that work?
Okay. So a couple different questions there. Usually, I mean, we help clients through the whole process.
Okay.
Um, and so it is a process. I don't know if you checked out our website, but
I did,
Planning
yeah.
Built for Life is our process, and it keys in on a couple things. The Built for Life part is about helping clients achieve the best life with the resources they have, right? So
Right.
it's very life centered, and it's based on the premise that life is not a rehearsal. You get one, and you never know when it's over, right? Or you never know when your body just won't let you do things that you want to do. And so
Right.
how do we find that balance? And I use the teeter totter, or a seesaw, depending on where you grew up.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, is a great imagery of financial planning, because everything has a trade-off. You know, do I save if I save too much today for a tomorrow that never comes? Or do I spend all today and then I'm unprepared for the future, right? That did come. And so it's finding this balance. So that's that planning built for, or that's the built for life part. The planning part is emphasis on the verb planning. So you do have to, your financial plan is dated once it hits print, if anybody prints financial plans anymore.
Yeah.
It is a process, because we're trying to project. If you're 50, you might have 10, 15, 20 years of work left, and then you
Yeah.
could have 30 more years of retirement. So you're projecting out 40 years. Nobody knows what that holds, right? But we're just trying to make some assumptions and projections. But if you just do that and run on that, you're going to be all over the place. Your margin of error is huge as the further you go out. So by planning and looking at things every year, you have a better sense of what 2025 is going to look like
Yeah.
than you do 2045.
Right.
And then next year, 2026 and 2027, we have a good idea what we want to do. but 2047 still kind of a blur. We have a
Yeah.
general vision of what we're trying to do. But as far as, as far as the couple goes and how they interact, you have to find your own vibe, right? Your own rhythm.
Yeah.
And weekly seems like a lot to me, but if that works for them, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
My wife and I, we talk about every quarter.
Okay.
We look at it deeper once a year, but if we have we always check in on, we kind of have an operating account so that we both contribute to, and then we do some things. We keep a little bit individual, but we
Yeah.
have full transparency with each
Yeah.
other. But that gives us a little bit of independence. But also the main thing we talk about is what I'll call our operating account. It's, that funds the home, the groceries, the car insurance, all of that stuff. We check in on that probably every month or so, and just how we're doing and make sure we're on budget. But yeah, not every week for us, but again, it's as a couple you have to find your rhythm.
Yeah, definitely. And it strikes me too that an important piece of this is not only is a couple getting on the same page and in terms of values and a unified vision and goals around finances, but you're also modeling for the kids in the household healthy relationships with financial decision making and finances. Do you talk much about that when you're talking, advising families about how to model for their kids,
Yeah.
how to maybe some things you can do with children at various ages to kind of help them have a better grasp on, because that's also something that doesn't often get taught in schools, right? Financial literacy isn't often taught. And so do you have some tips around that?
We don't a whole lot. It's
Right.
not that it doesn't come up, but we're not as involved with it. I mean, our clients do talk about it a little bit, but I think back to your original point is that their behavior is what models for their kids. I mean, obviously there are questions that come up about, can I do a Roth IRA for my kid, or my kid, can I employ my kid in my business, and things like that obviously come up, but those are unique situations that they're doing. And that's obviously older kids too. But I mean, it's not a big part of what we do, but it is important because you're right. There's not a lot of material taught to children about financial literacy at
Right.
all.
And those are the things that can lead to some of the stressors that can either strengthen relationships or end relationships in a lot of ways. I know statistically a lot of divorces, one of those pressure points on marriages is really around finances
For
and
sure.
if people aren't on the same page. And so
And
you're
I think that's a big part. They're just not on the same page, you know.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is what part of why I practice the way I do, is that I think it's easy. Money can be hard, right? I mean, if you don't have enough, that's
Yeah.
awful,
Yeah.
right? But I think money can be a scapegoat for people who are having relationship issues. And I've seen this in my past too, and whether you play the victim or you overspend to cope with some other feeling that you're having. And I mean, I've seen that before. Those are situations that require thick to help that behavior. And I think that's why you see financial therapy as a rising practice. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Are there, so you mentioned you guys have you have an ebook that's on your website, and we'll put a link to that in this, on the bottom of this podcast. But are there other books out there that you recommend to people that they read and thinking about, coming up with some of their financial goals, things that maybe have been something that you've really found value in in terms of resources, books, articles, other things like that?
Yeah, if you like blended family finance, I'll go back to Ron Deal. He wrote a book just a couple years ago, came out on blended family financial planning, and that's a good book. And I'm a fan of. I've read some of Mitch Anthony, some of his books. He's a coach to advisors on
Okay.
this life-centered planning. So I've been following him and been part of his programs for a long time now.
Okay.
But he's written books for the public. He's written books for advisors too. He calls it Return on Life, and so he's got a handful of books out there too. So he would be a good resource if you're interested in what's Brian talking about with lifestyle or life-centered planning.
Yeah.
That would be a good source.
Yeah.
Other than yeah,
And if people want to reach out to you directly or interested in your services, you're also in Minnesota, as am I, but
yes.
you have clients that are outside of the state of Minnesota as well, right?
We do, yeah. So
Okay.
Minnesota, Wisconsin primarily, but we have some clients down in Texas, Michigan, and I have one up in Maine. Um,
Oh,
just clients that have been with me for a long time that life has brought them to different places for the most part. But yeah, we're very accustomed to working virtually. Um, Even before COVID, we were working virtually because I've had clients in so many places, but we like to meet in person too. But virtual works just fine.
okay. So people can
Yeah.
find you through the website is probably the best first contact, right?
Yeah, it is. That's you could set up and we do like a 15-minute learn more call just to find out, what brought you to us, what are you looking for, to make sure we're even a fit before we take up more of all
More
of our
time.
time.
Yeah.
Um, and then we'd follow on. We call it a no stress prospect process. So we go through, you get all the way to the end of a 1-page plan, we call it, which is just here's our high level recommendations on what we would do for you before you ever have to decide to work with us. So we want to make it as free as possible for people to just not feel pressure. It's not a
Yeah.
sales process because for us, it's a process of making sure we find good clients that want to work with somebody for life. We want clients for life, you know, um, because it is a relationship for us. Our clients become like family, you know.
I love that. All right. Well, so I ask all my guests this question.
Okay.
If you were to any kind of advice, if you wanted to give any kind of advice to other fathers, doesn't necessarily have to be about finances. What would be your
Yeah.
advice to other dads out there listening to this podcast?
It's a great question. I'm going through, I have a couple kids who are young 20s, and then I have a teenager. So I'm still going through that teenage phase, and um, man, you just have to be available, and because you're not the cool dad you think you are. um,
Yeah.
and I did something just the other day with my 16-year-old. I picked him up at school and I just said, "Hey, when we get home, can I get 10 minutes of your time?"
Uh-huh.
And he's like, "What do you what do you want? What are we gonna do?" It's like, "You just need 10 minutes of your time. It'll be easy." And we got home and I grabbed the football and let's go out back and we just played catch, And it was just a simple thing. I'm like, why haven't I thought of that before? So just give 10 minutes of your time to your kids. You know, it means a lot. It'll mean a lot to you and it means a lot to them. I know he loved it. So,
Yeah. Thank you. Well, Brian, this has been such a great conversation. I think you're giving our audience a lot to think about. Dads out there, really thinking about these conversations, whether you're entering a blended family or just entering into a relationship where you're planning on having a family. I think these are important conversations about finance. Start early was a common theme in our conversation. And really, don't be afraid. You can't really hide these things. At some point you need to have these conversations because they impact the whole relationship and they impact the success of that relationship. So I really appreciate what you're doing with families out there. I think these are really important conversations that people are having, and the whole idea of um, a unified vision and goals for life is really, really powerful. So
Thank
appreciate
you.
that you're doing that. There's people out there like you yourself doing these things and having these conversations with people and helping people. And hopefully, I know I found a lot of value in this conversation. Hopefully you did as well. And hopefully our audience did as well.
I
So
did.
thank you
Thank
so
you,
much for
Blake.
being on the podcast today. And if you're interested in finding out more about Brian and his work, we'll put links at the bottom of the podcast. Please check it out. Check out their ebook and reach out to Brian if you are interested in maybe exploring these things in your own relationship. So thank you.
Thanks, Blake.
Dads, thanks for tuning in today for this important conversation. Hopefully you found as much value as I did in the conversation with Brian Peterson. One thing that I'm walking away with is that clear communication and vulnerability is vital when it comes to these conversations about finances, especially in blended families where the dynamics are just so much more complex. But really, in any relationship and any family, these are important conversations to have around money and finances. It'll make your relationship stronger, your family unit stronger, and ultimately lead to better success. Now, don't forget, if you found value in this conversation, if it resonated with you at all, please share with another dad or your partner or anyone else trying to navigate this blended family thing with intention. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. Those things will help our channel and help us bring you better and better content as we grow. We promise to keep delivering fantastic content to you. And don't forget that being a great dad isn't about having it all figured out. It's about showing up. It's about learning and building something better one day at a time. So dads, catch you on the next one.